is Armistice Day, and I saw a headline in a card that Veterans for Peace has put out. It was a headline of a newspaper from the day, from Armistice Day, and on top it said, "The greatest day in human history." It struck me because that was exactly the line that Donald Trump used to announce his peace agreement. He's never shy in self-congratulation. The topic that I chose to speak on was that the war to end all wars literally seeded the ground for another century of war. I was thinking as I was preparing that there are two songs from my era, and I love the fact that when I speak to nothing against you people that don't have gray hair, but I love to be with my demographic. We can tell stories, we can share things that we know happened. There was two songs from back when. One was War, What Is It Good For? Absolutely nothing. And the other was a simple piece of When Will They Ever Learn? And when I was listening to the talk around Gaza as it started, I had meetings with Tony Blinken and with Jake Sullivan, and was struck by the no lessons learned mentality. Met with Jake Sullivan at the White House, and he started with this very anguished relating of the trauma experienced by the Jewish people and how what happened on October 7th evoked for them the trauma of the pogroms and the Holocaust and the threat to their safety and security. And then we spoke for a while, and I came back and said, I understand that. I understand that because I had a mom, maybe a weird Lebanese mom, who, when I was young, read to me the diary of Anne Frank. And I had two uncles who were in World War II who wrote her almost every other day. I collected all the letters, and about when they first went into the camps, and I mean, it was an issue that I grew up with. I said, I understand it. I said, and I want you to understand that while I understand that trauma, I also understand the trauma of Palestinians, because I spent weeks in refugee camps in Lebanon hearing stories of the Nakba and understanding as best I could the experience of loss, the experience of having no place and being welcome no place. He didn't say anything. Conversation went on with some other people, and then in a very showy way, he said, "But before you go," he said, "I have to," and he started rubbing his head like this. He said, "I just have to respond to what you said when you talked about the trauma of Palestinians." He said, it smacked to me of whataboutism. I was like, Jake, I did not say this or that. I said, it's both. It's not a question of one cancels the other. It's a question of we have two people with trauma and we have to respond to both. It ended on a bad note. Went to see Blinken a couple days later, and at one point I said to Blinken, Tony, I said, Tony, there's been 6,000 killed so far that we know of. He said, absolutely deplorable, absolutely deplorable. I said, this number of civilian casualties, he said, yes, deplorable. A few minutes later, I said, that's why we need a ceasefire, and we have to stop it. He said, that would be deplorable too. And I said, well, so you have two deplorables, and the one you choose is the one that's going to cause more of the other. And he said, yeah, I guess if you put it that way, we simply can't surrender, have Israel surrender until Hamas is liquidated. And I'm not, my PhD is in religion, not in history, but I know enough history to know that that never happens, that what the seeds being planted in Gaza now are the next century's violence and conflict. And the empowerment or the sense of impunity on the part of Israelis is also at least another generation or two of violence and conflict. You know, when you're just beginning to develop a sense of security in your world, you have a sense of physical place. You know when you leave your house that your aunt lives down here, your mother's cousins live over there, and the churches or the mosque is there, or the friends that you play with and the area you play is over here. You have this physical sense of the world. You know kind of where you are and how to get from place to place. These kids have not only been forced to move in polling that we've done 10 times, lost everything. It's not just their house is gone, but the entire physical world in which they grew is gone. That trauma is almost impossible to calculate. What impact that has on the psyche of that kid, we cannot dismiss. And when it happens not to a kid, but to an entire generation of children, I don't think we can think about, I don't think we can imagine what this means for the next generation or more. Total liquidation of the physical world in which they found their place and in which they understood and defined themselves is gone. And yet I see these pictures of the kids in the rubble playing games like kids do with smiles and chasing each other, and it breaks my heart because underneath that sense of joy that children have is a sense of total dislocation that will have consequences as we move forward. I mean, we could talk about Gaza in terms of the numbers. I resent that because I wrote a book back in '78 called Palestinians, the Invisible Victims. It was about how Palestinians are reduced to, they're objectified, they're a number. Yesterday, 23 were killed. Yesterday, 15 were killed. Back when Baruch Goldstein did the massacre in the mosque in Hebron, the Washington Post had the number killed. They did 2 front-page stories on Baruch Goldstein. How did the good Jewish doctor go bad? What happened to him? They wanted to understand. Now, that to me is a legitimate inquiry. It's important that we understand what did happen to this guy to make him do that. I would think it's equally important when a Palestinian commits an act of terror that the same kind of investigation occur, the same kind of sort of getting under the skin of the event, probing and finding out what motivated, what caused it to happen. But when we met with Vice President Gore a few days later, he wanted to come and talk to the community about his sorrow of what happened. I actually did something that I probably shouldn't have done, although we were friends, and so I could get away with being bold with him. He talked about it, and he talked about the Goldstein stories, and I said, but Mr. Vice President, do you even know the names of the Palestinians who were killed? Have we talked to their parents? Did we see stories in the newspaper like Baruch Goldstein's parents were interviewed? His neighbors in Kiryat Arba were interviewed. It didn't exist. I went to, in 1981, there was a cross-border clash between Israel and the PLO in Lebanon. PLO fired a missile and an Israeli died. That night I turned on the TV news and there were ambulances, lights flaring, flashing back and forth, and the rescue crews were there, and there was smoke in the air, and the cameramen and the reporters interviewed people, and they were crying, and it was traumatic, and it was hurtful and painful and whatever, and it was, it was a story about people suffering in war. The next day, Israel bombed the Fakani neighborhood in Lebanon. 283 people were killed in one huge apartment building that went down. I turned on TV that night. The reporters were at that same street in northern Israel reporting about the aftermath of the attack in Israel and noting that, yes, Israel today retaliated and bombed in Beirut. The third day,
they had gotten their crews together in Beirut. And I watched TV, and as I saw it, the reporters were standing on a street with rubble behind them. This is the scene where yesterday Israel bombed Lebanon. So I got to talk to those journalists when they came back to the States, and I said, why didn't you cover it that night when it happened? And he said, well, we got there, but there were lights flashing, and there was smoke, and there was people running around, and we thought we'd wait until the next day so we could see the extent and show the extent of the damage that was done. I said, oh, so in Israel the story was the people, but in Beirut the story was the rubble. And think about the Gaza stories that you see. Yes, I think it's important that we see the rubble, but I want to know the parents of the kid who lost his limbs. I want to know the parents of the kid. I want to know the kid who lost his parents. 17,000 wounded children in Lebanon, many amputees who have no surviving family member. I want to talk to them. The notion that 250 Israeli hostages, the names of whom we got to know, the stories of whom we got to hear, their faces we got to see. Media says 2,000 Palestinian captives were. Do you know any of them? Did you see any of them? Do you even know how they got captured in the first place? Is it even a story worth telling? The woman who was the inspector general for the army in Israel just lost her job because she released a video showing the torture of these Palestinian prisoners in some of the grossest things that were done to them, and she was accused of a blood libel. Oh, tell the truth and it's a blood libel. And she went into hiding. She was afraid for her life. I started the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in 1975. I met with victims of torture. Back during the Carter administration, there's a rule that that people accused of crimes or convicted of crimes in a foreign country can't apply for U.S. visas to the U.S. So there's a famous story back in the Carter years called the Jerusalem Files, because this woman who was in the visa desk gave visas to 23 Palestinians who had been convicted of felony crimes in Israel. When we get to the story, we find that they'd come in and interviewed. They had told her the story. She went to the consul general, who sent the stories to the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Pat Darien, who became a friend of mine, a wonderful woman. She read them and she said, those stories sound real. They were tortured into giving confessions. And because all of them had been convicted based solely on a confession, which they recanted after giving it, Pat Darien deemed them eligible for visas. I got to know those 23, not all of them, but about 6 or 7 of them became friends of mine. Some lived in Virginia, some lived in Arizona. What happened to them was, I'm not going to tell you, but it was disgusting what the Israelis did to them. Sexually abused them in grotesque ways. This is not a new thing. And it's not an Israeli thing. What it is a power dynamic. When you have absolute control and people are under you, the tendency is to abuse. Happened here, happens everywhere, happens in prisons here. I remember when working with Vice President Gore, I had to go a number of times to Gaza and the West Bank. I remember being at the border in Gaza when the daily lineup, people crossing the border, the single largest employer was day labor jobs in Israel, like Southwest LA. They gather at a point, the trucks come, they pick who goes. The lucky ones go, I guess. The unlucky ones go back home. No food, no money that day for their family. This happens at 7 o'clock in the morning. They go, they work, they come back at 8, 9 o'clock at night. They get home at 10. They go to bed to get up the next day and get in line all over again. But what struck me was that these men were lined up in cattle chutes, you know, that were about this high, and they were about that wide. And the Israeli soldiers, young boys with guns, straddled the cattle chutes as the men walked up to them, under them, and they shouted, "Don't look up at me. Don't look up at me." They wanted them to hold their document up. "Don't look at me. Don't look at me." And the Palestinians, rather dutifully, walked like this as their IDs were looked at. I wrote a piece when I got back about the master-slave dialectic that was playing out in that situation. The soldier sounded angry, but was scared shitless. The Palestinian looked submissive, like, "Yes, massa, yes, massa." But inside there was a burning anger that was waiting to explode. That defined the dynamic. History didn't begin on October 7th, right? The slave exploded and did grotesque things. Yes, they did. It was terrorism. Have to call it what it is. Some Palestinians don't want me to say that. It was terrorism. It was brutal. It was grotesque. Never should have happened. Didn't help Palestine at all. It started a conflict that the Israelis took advantage of. I was saying today that one of the lessons that I heard being taught during the Intifada was, if you throw a stone, they'll shoot you. If you shoot them, they'll bring tanks out against you. If you got tanks, they use their fighter jets. The Palestinians are fighting an enemy that knows no limit to the violence that they're willing to use. That has to go into your calculation when you think of what to do. And they didn't put it in their calculation. They did something grotesque, and Israel sprung into action with obscene violence, obscene amounts of violence. We know the numbers, I said. We know the consequences, immediate consequences. What we don't know are the long-term consequences. Know the number dead, we think. We know the number wounded, we think. We know the number without families. We know from polling that we've done and other studies that have been done the number of times people have been forced to move. We know the absence of food, the absence of water, the absence of sanitation. I mean, what do you do if you're a 13-year-old girl and you just got your period and there's no sanitation at all? There's nothing. What does that little girl do? What do her parents do? I mean, the little things of life are missing. Mothers can't nurse because they basically don't have enough water to drink themselves. And they don't dare use the water in powdered milk because the water is impure. I could go on, and I just hate to even go on and on and on with it. But I just want to leave you with this thought. Your presence here tonight is gratifying. And in some ways, for me, it's exciting. I've been doing this work since the 70s. I don't think I've ever seen the degree of understanding, of support, of compassion for Palestinians that I see today. It's become an issue that hasn't just won support, but the support is visceral. I remember saying to Kamala Harris that she needed to talk about it. And she said, well, what can I do? And I said, well, you're giving a speech tonight. It was Hispanic Heritage Month. This was back in, like, weeks after the October 7th. And I said, why don't you say something about it? Say something to give Palestinians hope. Say something to call for an end to this. She said, the speech is already written and it's in the teleprompter. I said, go off the record. You can do that. I mean, Clinton did that. She said, I'm not Bill Clinton. I said, you can try. And she laughed and whatever. And the call ended. The next day, her staff sent me a video of her speech, that part of the speech where she talked about Palestinians need the right to self-determination and that there should be a ceasefire. The applause was deafening, and it was a Hispanic audience during Hispanic Heritage Month. At the convention, the Democratic convention, 4 people mentioned Palestinians: Kamala, Bernie, AOC, and Keith Ellison. Again, massive applause. In fact, I was struck by the description of Kamala Harris's speech, where she talked about our unbreakable, unshakable bond, all of the uns, whatever that we do when we sort of want to be excessive about our love for Israel. Dead. She said, and we support the right of Palestinians. The room burst into applause. It was by design that she'd do the one and then cover it with the applause she'd get for the other so that it would sort of be an applause line in the speech. It is, I know from our polling, I know from our work around the country, I know from what I'm seeing, I know from the members of Congress who are saying, I will not take any pro-Israel money in this campaign. There is a change, and it's not just a change where people are questioning what Israel does, but more significantly, it's a change where people are saying, I feel for these people. I can identify with these people. I want to let people know I care about Palestinians too. That's new. I can tell you from from the scars. I mean, they talk about he earned his stripes. I earned my scars. They're my stripes from dealing with this. It's a different country today, and it's happening on the left. It's also happening in a weird way on the right. But for whatever reason, the days of unchecked support, no questions asked, are over. And I think this next election will be an interesting one in this regard. I mean, we tried for years to have a debate about Palestine. We're going to get one. We're going to get one because people want to hear about it right now. And they want their Congress people to be on the side of justice. So a number of people in this room alone can make a difference in congressional districts in this area. Because you all know how to do politics in Iowa. I know that because I've been coming for a long time. You're the folks who look people in the eye and say, tell me what you think. And they want to answer you because they got to answer you. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful about, as my uncle Farid used to say, this young generator. Kids have a global consciousness that is sort of, it's a new phenomenon. I mean, when a poll was done in 2003, a month before the Iraq War, 11% of Americans could find Iraq on a map. 3 years later, we did the same poll, and the number jumped to 37. That ain't the case anymore. People know who the Rohingya are. They know who the Uyghurs are. They know who the Sudanese and the Darfuris are. They know who the Palestinians are. And they know stuff about them, and they see these genocides playing out in real time, and they care about it, and they want to hold people accountable for it. And there's a difference. This is not your granddaddy's Iowa anymore. This is a whole different place with people who care in a different way. And I think that is what gives me hope in the midst of all of this darkness, is that maybe we can see the beginning, the unraveling. Because here's the thing. I talk about this a lot. I call it the spoiled child and the abused child syndromes. I've seen it with my grandkids. Parents will say, don't do this, and they go ahead and do it. If you do it, there are going to be consequences, and they go ahead and do it, and guess what? There are no consequences. The kids say to themselves, doesn't matter. I can do whatever I want. They're not going to do anything. And they might even sneak it, but they're going to do it because they just feel no consequences when that. We call it impunity or being spoiled. On the other side, there's the abused child syndrome, and that's that it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to get punished and you're going to be called out for it. And so what you do is you act out. If I'm going to get punished, then I might as well be outrageous, and then it's kind of a screw you. And what we have is this playing out between Israelis and Palestinians, where there's nothing they can do good, they're going to get screwed. And there's nothing they can do bad, because they're going to get good stuff anyway. And so when people say to me, are you talking about cutting off all ties? No, I said, I'm talking about creating consequences. Because if you create consequences for Israel, here's what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that the peace movement in Israel that died, because when I used to go over there in the early 90s when I was working on this project after Oslo, people like the current president of Israel, Herzog, I sat with him and we had coffee one afternoon. He was just the son of the former president or former prime minister of Israel. He said, you know, we count on the U.S. because we keep telling the right we can't build settlements because the U.S. will take sanctions against us. After 30 years of no sanctions and continued settlement building, that peace movement in Israel died because what were they going to say? They say, don't do this because the U.S. look like mad. The U.S. doesn't get mad. They look like fools, so they just shut up. And Israel's policy and politics have moved so far to the right, you could not imagine, you couldn't construct a government with a leader who would get 61 votes in the Knesset, who would actually pursue policies very different than those of Netanyahu. Frankly, that's the problem. The peace movement would be emboldened in Israel. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it would give them a leg to stand on. At the same time, with Palestinians, it would create a sense of hope. It would say, well, maybe the U.S., maybe the moderates in the Palestinians, moderates is a bad word, but maybe those who think that peace is possible would be heartened enough to speak out and take a leadership. Right now, if you're a Palestinian and you say, oh, we ought to do this because this nonviolent approach works, you get laughed at. In the wake of genocide over here and towns and villages being rampaging settlers going through and burning olive trees, burning cars, burning homes, evicting people from their land, say, oh, let's be peaceful. You look like an idiot. And so what needs to happen is some dynamic has to change so that people who want peace in Israel will be pursuing to fight, will be encouraged to fight for it, and Palestinians will say, somebody is going to stick up for us, somebody will fight for us, somebody will be on our side. The U.S. can be different. But as it stands right now, I ain't seeing that, and that's the problem. But we can make a difference. I remember Pete McCloskey. Do you remember Pete McCloskey? Come on, you got to remember Pete McCloskey, member of Congress back in the 70s and 80s. He's known for being pro-Palestinian, wonderful guy. But I knew him back in 1968 because he was a former Marine colonel who ran in a Republican primary. It was actually a runoff election to replace somebody who died. And he beat Shirley Temple. That's a big deal. And he ran, she was a protege of Ronald Reagan, but she ran for the war in Vietnam, and he ran opposed to the war in Vietnam. When he beat her, rather handily, he got to Congress, and it was like, did you ever read the book Siddhartha? The Buddha story? Where he's sheltered from suffering of all kinds, and sheltered from people old, people sick, people hungry, people. He's sheltered from all of that. And one day he's in the woods, and he sees an old sick man, and the thought crosses through his head, could that happen to me? And it was trauma. That's where he got the notion that that desire becomes suffering. So Anyway, that's the Buddha story, but I called Pete McCloskey coming to Washington a Siddhartha moment, because members of Congress who supported the Vietnam War said, wait, could that happen to me? Could I lose an election over this issue? That's what we got to do. We got to beat some people on this issue and have the ones who support justice win. Don't have to win them all, but win enough of them so that they begin to say, wait a minute, that's not an issue I can run on anymore. I can't be supporting this the way I did. The number of people, pro-Israel people in Congress who've come out and said, I won't take any pro-Israel money anymore, that's saying something, because these guys are, sorry, don't mean to disillusion anybody, members of Congress are not principled people. I hope this is not going to cause some of you to lose sleep tonight. So you almost take advantage of their lack of principle by making them aware that, yeah, you can lose on this one. This is not a winner for you. And then maybe they'll do the right thing. But thank you all very much.